When the first hard frost settled over the frontier, families knew it was time. Hog killing season had come. A single animal, raised all year on kitchen scraps and fallen acorns, had to carry a whole household through the long, hungry months ahead. Nothing was wasted. Not the fat, not the feet, not the blood, not the bones. Every scrap was salted, smoked, rendered, or pickled into something that would last until spring. These 25 foods kept pioneer families alive through winters that killed the unprepared. Some you would still recognize. Others have vanished so completely that most Americans have never tasted them. Number one fed families for months from a single hanging cut. But we begin our countdown with the humblest scraps of all. Let's start with number 25. Number 25. Pickled pig's ears were one of the first things a frontier family ate after the killing because they could not be kept long any other way. The ears were scraped clean, singed of every bristle, over an open flame, then simmered soft and packed into a stone crock with vinegar, salt, and whatever peppercorns the pantry held. The vinegar did the work the smokehouse could not, turning a scrap most people would throw away into something that kept for weeks on a cold shelf. Children learned to like the strange gelatinous crunch because there was nothing else to do with it. Sliced thin and eaten cold, with a little mustard, pickled ears stretched the animal that much further. On the frontier, taste was a luxury and waste was a sin. The humble ear was proof that a family understood both. Number 24. Pig's tails went straight into the pot, curled and knotted little things that most households today would not know how to cook. Frontier families boiled them slow with beans or greens, where the small amount of meat and the rich gelatin from the bones thickened the whole dish and made it stick to the ribs. A single tail could flavor a pot big enough to feed a table of children. Some cooks salted them down to keep, pulling one out whenever a bland pot of dried peas needed help. There was almost no meat on a tail, but there was fat, collagen, and flavor, and on a homestead that could not be wasted. The tail carried no prestige and earned no place at Sunday dinner, but it did its quiet work at the bottom of the pot, turning thin winter rations into something a body could actually live on. Number 23. Neck bones anchored the everyday winter pot when the good cuts were being saved for later. There was little meat clinging to them, but that meat was sweet and dark, and the bones themselves gave up marrow and gelatin that turned water into broth. Frontier cooks simmered neck bones for hours with dried beans, cabbage, or cornmeal dumplings until the meat fell away and could be picked from the bone with a fork. It was slow food born of necessity, a way to feed a family on the parts a richer household might have discarded. The smell of neck bones and onions cooking down filled a cabin on a gray afternoon, promising that supper was coming even when the smokehouse hams stayed untouched. Cheap, humble, and endlessly useful, neck bones were the workhorse of the winter kitchen, quietly holding a household together between the more celebrated meals. Number 22. Pickled pig's feet took patience and a strong stomach, but they kept for months and gave a family protein deep into the lean season. The feet were scrubbed, singed, and split, then simmered for hours until the skin and tendons turned tender and the whole thing threatened to fall apart. Packed into crocks and covered with spiced vinegar brine, they cured on a cold shelf until the meat took on a sharp, tangy bite. Eating them was a messy, bone-picking affair, all soft skin and rich gelatin, but nothing on a frontier hog was too humble to save. Pickled feet showed up at the table when the fresh meat was long gone and the family needed something with body to it. Today, most Americans have never seen a jar, but for pioneer households, they were a dependable, shelf-stable insurance against the hungry weeks before spring. Number 21. Hog jowl was the cheek of the pig, a fatty, flavorful cut, that frontier families cured and smoked just like bacon, then hung in the smokehouse to keep. Thick with fat and streaked with lean, it was cut into slabs and fried, or dropped whole into a pot of greens and dried beans where it melted down and seasoned everything around it. A little jowl went a long way, and a family could make one animal's cheeks last through weeks of humble suppers. Down through the years, it became the meat of New Year's Day, cooked with black-eyed peas and greens to bring luck and prosperity in the coming year, a tradition that outlived the frontier that created it. Cheap, rich, and endlessly practical, hog jowl was proof that even the face of the animal held something worth saving for the cold months ahead. Number 20. Chitterlings, or chitlins, were the small intestines of the hog, and cleaning them was the hardest, most thankless job of the entire butchering day. They had to be turned inside out and scraped and rinsed again and again in cold water until every trace was gone, a labor that could take the better part of an afternoon. Boiled long and then often battered and fried, they carried a powerful smell that filled the whole cabin and drove some family members out into the cold. But chitlins fed people when there was little else, and in many households, particularly across the South, they became a treasured tradition passed carefully from one generation to the next. They asked more work than almost any other part of the animal, but a frontier family that threw nothing away found a way to make even the guts into a meal worth gathering around. Number 19. Brains and eggs was the cook's reward on butchering morning. A rich breakfast that had to be eaten fresh because the brains would not keep. Scooped carefully from the split skull, they were rinsed, then scrambled together with eggs in a hot skillet slicked with fresh lard until they set into a soft, creamy mass. It was one of the first hot meals of hog-killing time, served to the tired workers who had risen before dawn to do the heavy labor of the day. The texture was delicate and the flavor mild and rich, unlike anything from a plain cut of muscle. Because brains spoiled within a day, this was a dish that came around only once a year, tied forever to the cold morning of the kill. Rarely seen on any American table now, brains and eggs was once a small seasonal luxury born of the simple fact that nothing could be wasted. Number 18. Sauce, sometimes called head cheese, turned the least appetizing parts of the hog into a firm, sliceable loaf that kept well in the cold. The head, feet, and trimmings were simmered for hours until the meat fell from the bone. Then it was chopped fine, seasoned hard with vinegar, salt, sage, and pepper, and pressed into a mold. As it cooled, the natural gelatin from the bones set the whole thing solid, holding the bits of meat suspended in a firm jelly. Sliced cold and eaten on bread or with a sharp pickle, souse stretched the odds and ends of the animal into days of easy meals that needed no cooking. It looked strange, and it puzzled outsiders, but frontier families knew it as thrift made edible. Where a modern cook sees waste, the pioneer cook saw a loaf of meat waiting to be built from a boiling pot. Number 17. Fresh spare ribs were the great feast of butchering day, the one meal where a hard-working family let themselves eat with abandon. Ribs could not be cured well and did not keep, so they were roasted or fried and eaten right away, hot and dripping, while everyone was still gathered for the killing. After a year of salted and smoked meat, the taste of fresh pork straight off the animal was a rare and joyful thing. Neighbors often came to help with the heavy work, and the ribs were their payment, shared around a crowded table as the smokehouse filled behind them. There was laughter and grease on every chin, a brief moment of plenty in a life defined by careful rationing. The spare ribs marked the one day of the year when the frontier family ate as if the meat would never run out, because for a few hours it truly seemed it never would. Number 16. Backbone and chine were cooked fresh in the days right after the kill, before the cold could be trusted to hold them any longer. The backbone was cut into sections, each knuckle of bone surrounded by sweet, dark meat, and simmered slow in a heavy pot until it turned fork tender. Often it was cooked down with cornmeal dumplings, dropped right into the rich broth, a dish that fed a large family cheaply and filled the cabin with a heavy, comforting smell. Because the backbone held so much bone and so little muscle, it was never a cut for keeping, only for eating soon and eating together. It belonged to that short window of plenty around the killing when fresh meat was briefly abundant. Backbone stew has all but disappeared from American kitchens, but on the frontier, it was a seasonal certainty, the taste of the days when the whole hog had just been brought in. Number 15. The tenderloin was the finest fresh cut the hog had to give, and on the frontier, it was eaten quickly and gratefully in the first days after the kill. Lean, tender, and mild, it needed no long curing and no heavy seasoning, just a hot skillet and a little fresh lard. Sliced into medallions and fried, it might be served with milk gravy poured over biscuits, the closest thing to a fine meal a homestead family knew. Because it was small and would not keep like the salted cuts, the tenderloin was a fleeting pleasure, gone within days of the butchering. It was often the piece set aside for the woman of the house or the smallest children, a tender bite in a life of tough, salty rations. For a family that spent most of the year eating cured meat, the fresh tenderloin was a brief, quiet taste of abundance before the long winter of salt and smoke began. Number 14. Cracklings were the crisp, golden bits left behind when the fat was rendered down into lard, and no frontier cook ever threw them away. As the fat melted in the great iron kettle over an outdoor fire, the little pieces of skin and fat that did not fully dissolve turned brown and crunchy and were skimmed off and salted. Eaten by the handful straight from the pot, they were a treat the children waited all day for during rendering. Rich, salty, and satisfying, cracklings delivered a burst of pure energy that a hard-working homestead body needed through the cold. What was truly a byproduct of making lard became a prize in its own right, a small reward for the long, smoky work of the rendering fire. On the frontier, nothing was ever simply waste, and the humble cracklin proved that even the leftovers of the leftovers could be turned into something good. Number 13, cracklin cornbread took those crisp bits of rendered fat and folded them into the daily bread, turning a plain staple into something rich enough to stand as a meal. The cook stirred the salted cracklings into a simple batter of cornmeal, water, and a little salt, then baked it in a hot greased skillet until the crust turned deep brown and the fat crisped through every bite. The result was a dense, savory bread studded with pockets of pork flavor, filling enough to satisfy a working family with nothing more than a pot of beans beside it. Cracklin bread stretched the little bit of pork left in the cracklings across a whole pan, feeding many mouths from a handful of scraps. It was the frontier at its most resourceful, taking the byproduct of rendering and building it into the cornerstone of a winter supper. Simple, cheap, and deeply satisfying, it fed households on almost nothing. Number 12. Pork rinds, the fried and puffed skin of the hog, were another way frontier families made sure not 1 inch of the animal went to waste. The skin was scraped clean, cut into pieces, and slowly cooked in hot lard until it blistered and puffed into a light, crackling crisp. Salted while still hot, the rinds became a snack that kept for a good while in a dry crock and gave a burst of fat and salt whenever hunger struck between meals. They were cheap to make and used a part of the animal that would otherwise have been discarded, which was reason enough for any careful homestead to bother. Long before they appeared in shiny bags on store shelves, pork rinds were a homemade byproduct of butchering day, cooked over the same fire that rendered the lard. The frontier family knew the skin was food too, and they treated it that way. Number 11. Blood pudding was the most direct answer to the frontier rule that nothing be wasted, using the very blood of the hog collected at the killing. The fresh blood was caught in a basin, stirred to keep it from clotting, then mixed with cooked grains, fat, onions, and hard seasoning before being stuffed into cleaned casings and simmered until firm. Sliced and fried in a hot pan, it turned dark and rich, a dense food packed with iron and energy that a laboring body craved in the cold. It had to be made immediately on the day of the kill because the blood would not keep even overnight. Many families across the frontier, carrying the old country traditions with them, made some version of it, though it has faded almost entirely from American kitchens. Strange to modern eyes, blood pudding was once simply the logical end of a philosophy that let no part of the animal fall to waste. Number 10. Liver pudding, known in some regions as liver mush, ground the hog's liver together with cornmeal, broth, and sage into a soft loaf that could be sliced and fried through the week. The liver, which spoiled fast and could not be kept fresh, was cooked and mashed while it was still good, then bound with meal and seasoning and pressed into a pan to set. Once cold and firm, slices were cut and browned in a skillet until crisp on the outside and creamy within, eaten with eggs at breakfast or on bread at supper. It was a clever way to preserve the flavor and nutrition of an organ that would otherwise be lost within a day. Rich in iron and cheap to make, liver pudding fed families well into winter. In parts of the rural South, it survives to this day, but for most Americans, it has slipped quietly out of memory. Number 9. Scrapple, called pawn house by the Pennsylvania Dutch who made it famous, was the frontier's masterpiece of thrift, built from every last scrap the boiling pot gave up. After the head and bones were simmered soft, the meat was picked off, and the rich broth was thickened with cornmeal and buckwheat flour, seasoned with sage and pepper, and poured into pans to set. Once cold, it firmed into a loaf that could be sliced and fried in lard until a crisp brown crust formed over the soft center. Served hot at breakfast, often with molasses or apple butter, scrapple turned the humblest trimmings into a dish families genuinely loved. The name itself told the truth of it, a meal made from scraps that would otherwise be lost. Where souse used vinegar and jelly, scrapple used grain and the skillet, and it fed frontier households cheaply and well through the whole of a hard winter. Number 8. Fresh sausage was made in the busy hours after the kill, when the trimmings and lesser cuts were ground fine and seasoned hard with sage, salt, and red pepper. Some was cooked and eaten right away, formed into patties and fried up for the workers who had labored all day. The rest was the beginning of the family's winter meat, seasoned to taste and set aside to be preserved by smoke, by salt, or by lard in the days that followed. Making sausage was a communal task, with hands grinding and mixing and stuffing late into the evening while the kettle of lard still steamed outside. The smell of sage and frying pork filled the cabin, a sign of the plenty that came only once a year. Fresh sausage was the frontier family's way of taking the odd bits of the animal and shaping them, quite literally, into meals that would carry them for months. Number 7. Smoked sausage was how a family made that fresh ground meat last deep into the cold months without a trace of refrigeration. The seasoned sausage was stuffed into cleaned casings, tied off into links, and hung in the smokehouse above a low, smoldering fire of hickory or oak. Days of slow, cool smoke dried the links and drove out moisture, sealing the meat against spoilage and giving it a deep, savory flavor no fresh sausage could match. Hung from the rafters, the links kept for the whole winter, cut down one at a time whenever a meal needed meat. The smokehouse became the family's larder, its dark interior heavy with the scent of curing pork. Smoked sausage was security. You could hang from a beam, a wall of food against the hungry weeks ahead. It asked skill and patience, but it repaid the family with meat that lasted long past the killing. Number 6. Ham hocks were the smoked joints of the leg, tough and full of bone, and a frontier family treasured them for the way they could flavor an entire pot. Cured and hung with the rest of the smokehouse meat, a hock kept for months and gave up its richness slowly, simmered for hours with dried beans, peas, or greens, until the meat loosened and the broth turned deep and smoky. There was not much to eat on a hock itself, but that was never the point. One small, cheap joint could season a pot big enough to feed a family for 2 days, stretching a whisper of pork into a mountain of beans. It was the taste of thrift, the way a household with little meat made every meal feel rich. Ham hocks did quiet, essential work at the bottom of the winter pot, and a wise cook was never without one hanging in reserve. Number 5. Salt pork, sometimes called sow belly, was the true daily survival food of the frontier, the plain salted fat and belly that a family leaned on when everything else ran low. Slabs of fatty pork were packed in barrels between thick layers of salt, which drew out the moisture and held off spoilage for months without any need for cold. When the cook needed it, a piece was sliced off, sometimes soaked to draw down the salt, then fried until the fat rendered and the meat crisped. That grease-flavored beans, greens, cornbread, and gravy, spreading the taste of pork across meals that held little else. Salt pork was not a treat and never pretended to be, but it was reliable, and reliability was everything in a hard winter. It was the meat that carried families through the leanest weeks, plain and salty, and always there when the smokehouse hams were being saved. Number 4. Fatback was the thick layer of hard fat from along the hog's spine, salted down and kept for the single most important job in the frontier kitchen, seasoning. Nearly pure fat with little lean, it was cut into pieces and fried to render its grease, which became the cooking medium for almost everything a family ate. A small piece of fatback dropped into a pot of collards, beans, or field peas turned plain vegetables into a rich, satisfying meal. Salted and stored, it kept for a long time on a cool shelf, always ready to give up its fat when a dish needed depth. In a diet built heavily on cornmeal and dried beans, that fat was not indulgence, but survival, the concentrated energy that kept hard-working bodies going through the cold. Fatback carried no glamour, yet few things in the frontier pantry were used more often or valued more quietly. Number 3. Bacon, known on the frontier as side meat or middlin, came from the belly of the hog and was cured and smoked to last through the long winter. The slabs were rubbed with salt, sometimes with a little sugar and pepper, and left to cure before being hung in the smokehouse to take on the flavor of slow hickory smoke. What came out kept for months, a striped slab of fat and lean that could be sliced thin and fried for breakfast or cut thick to flavor a pot. Side meat was one of the family's most dependable stores, more everyday than the prized ham, but far more precious than salt pork. Its grease started countless meals, and its smoky flavor ran through the whole winter table. Every homestead knew the taste of side meat crackling in the morning skillet, a sound and a smell that meant the smokehouse had done its work and the family would eat. Number 2. Lard was the single most important product the whole hog gave, the rendered fat that made nearly every other winter food possible. The fat trimmings were cut small and melted down for hours in a great iron kettle over an open fire, stirred constantly until they gave up their clear golden grease, which was strained and poured into crocks to harden. That lard was cooking oil, preservative, and pure calories all at once. It fried the meat, made the biscuits and pie crust tender, and greased every skillet on the homestead. Sausage patties were even cooked and then packed down into crocks of it, sealed under a layer of fat that kept them good for months. On a diet where fat meant energy and energy meant surviving the cold, lard was liquid gold. A family that rendered its hog well had, in those heavy crocks, the foundation of everything they would cook until spring. Number 1, the smoked cured ham was the crown of the whole animal, the finest cut, saved and smoked with the greatest care, and hung in the smokehouse as the family's proudest possession. The hind legs were rubbed hard with salt, sometimes with sugar and pepper, and left to cure for weeks before being hung over a slow, cool fire of hickory to smoke for days on end. Done right, a ham would keep not just through one winter, but sometimes for a year or more, its flavor deepening the longer it aged in the dark, smoky rafters. This was not everyday food. A ham was cut into on special occasions, for Christmas dinner or the arrival of guests, each slice a small celebration of a year's hard work. Hanging in the smokehouse, it represented security, patience, and pride all at once, the tangible proof that a family had wrestled a whole winter's survival from a single hog. When the last ham was finally gone, spring was near, and the frontier family had made it through once more. 25 foods from a single hog, and not one scrap wasted. From pickled ears to the smokehouse ham, every part of the animal was salted, smoked, rendered, or pickled into something that stood between a family and a hungry winter. Most of these foods have faded from American tables, replaced by refrigerators and grocery aisles that made such careful thrift unnecessary. But for the families who lived it, hog killing time was the difference between surviving the winter and not. Which of these have you tasted, and which had you never even heard of? Let me know down in the comments.